Franklin Roosevelt recognized the power of radio, which let every citizen feel as if the president was talking personally to him or her. At a time of sharp social tensions and divisions, these fireside chats made Americans feel like they were part of a larger, more unified whole.
With the cooperation of various city departments and under the sponsorship of the Crime Prevention Bureau of the Police Department, a number of city streets have been set aside for the use of the children of New York. Safe from the perils of crowded traffic thoroughfares, the youngsters are watchfully supervised by trained instructors removed from relief rows.
Images of these New Deal projects appeared in magazines and newsreels, allowing Americans to experience faraway tragedies and triumphs. Moviegoers in New York could feel the Kansas Dust Bowl as it swirled around on the screen before them. They could watch workers in Oregon busily building a huge new dam. And they could visit a civilian conservation corps camp in Vermont, if only for a few flickering frames. When Americans turned on their radios, they heard not only the president, but also his wife. Host of a twice-weekly radio program, Eleanor Roosevelt became known as a tireless advocate of the poor and downtrodden. Within the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt helped African Americans gain access to her husband. Thanks in large part to Eleanor's influence, a so-called Black Cabinet advised the president for the first time in United States history. African Americans continued to face massive hardships on many fronts. The National Recovery Administration's Blue Eagle codes allowed employers to fire blacks and replace them with white workers. Bitter African Americans joked that the NRA was the Negro Removal Act, and the New Deal's poor relief often failed to reach African Americans.
Dear Mr. President, would you please direct the people in charge of the relief work to issue the provisions to our suffering colored people? I'm sorry to worry you with this, Mr. President, but the relief officials here give us black folks nothing but a few cans of pickled meat. And to white folks, they give blankets, bolts of cloth, and things like that. Yours truly. I can't sign my name, Mr. President. They will beat me up and run me away from here, and this is my home.
Franklin Roosevelt never supported African Americans as strongly as Eleanor did. Over the protests of his Black Cabinet and his own wife, the President of the United States refused to support a federal law to fight lynching. Since Southerners occupied strategic places on most of the Senate and House committees, Roosevelt believed that introducing an anti-lynching bill would cause the Southerners to block every bill he had asked Congress to pass. He would not take the risk. For Franklin Roosevelt's first New Deal, Black Monday came on May 27, 1935. On that morning, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the National Industrial Recovery Act was unconstitutional in two ways. The most important of which was that the act violated the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which allows Congress to regulate commerce between states, but not within them. Which other new legislation might the court strike down? The New Deal was also under fire from wealthy and conservative Americans. The American Liberty League, a coalition of rich businessmen, lobbied against what they regarded as the New Deal's reckless spending and socialist reforms. But Franklin Roosevelt was hardly a socialist. Rather than overthrowing the American free market system, he worked to save it. To preserve, Roosevelt said, we had to reform. Other New Deal critics embraced socialist or even communist solutions. In California, novelist Upton Sinclair ran for governor on a platform that called for workers, not bosses, to own and operate their factories. Communism was making inroads in the United States. The Great Depression convinced many people that capitalism did not work. Communism appeared to offer a solution. The Communist Party's support of workers and equal rights for African Americans made it seem like a modern and progressive movement in line with traditional American values. The Communist Party attracted a wide variety of Americans, ranging from high school and college students to Southern sharecroppers, from steel workers and electricians to social reformers and intellectuals. Why, the Communists asked, should businesses be privately owned? If workers owned industry, they said, it would serve the great whole rather than the greedy few. Franklin Roosevelt was moving to head off the grassroots challenges to his New Deal. He weighed in with a hefty new round of legislation, a second New Deal. High atop the agenda stood his Emergency Relief Appropriation Act to get people back to work. To calm the fears of senior citizens, Roosevelt introduced the Social Security Act, creating the nation's first federal old age insurance system.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
Social Security provided a measure of security for some 30 million Americans, but it did not cover many of the most needy, for among those excluded were domestic workers and farm workers, day laborers, and almost everyone who was underemployed. A second legislative initiative was the Revenue Act, or Wealth Tax Act, which was designed to increase taxes on the rich. And in an appeal to workers, Roosevelt supported the Wagner Act, which required companies to bargain with any union that its workers chose. No longer could a company fire an employee just for joining a union. For the first time, the federal government would protect the rights of workers. After passage of the Wagner Act, union membership grew from 3 million to 9 million in the 1930s. Using the new tactic of sit-down strikes, they won recognition from General Motors and other industrial giants. The fight to unionize industries was long and bloody. But by the end of the 1930s, the country's unions were stronger than ever before. Union members also voted for Franklin Roosevelt. With overwhelming labor support, Roosevelt was re-elected in a landslide in 1936. After Roosevelt's re-election, only the Supreme Court remained a thorn in Roosevelt's side. Earlier in 1936, it wiped out another jewel of the first New Deal, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Now it threatened to strike down the second New Deal, too, especially the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act. So Franklin Roosevelt decided to strike first. In 1937, Roosevelt proposed a new federal law that would allow him to select up to 6 judges, increasing the size of the Supreme Court to 15. That way, he could ensure that a majority of justices would uphold his New Deal. But the plan backfired. Americans condemned the idea of overturning a constitutional tradition like the 9-man court. Critics compared Roosevelt to Hitler and Mussolini, who were busily destroying their own national constitutions. Just as the court-packing controversy reached a crescendo, the United States plunged back into a deep recession. Between Labor Day and New Year's, 2 million Americans lost their jobs. By the following March, the number would top 4 million. Industrial production plummeted faster than at any time in our history, the Great Crash included. What had gone wrong? Just before this new crash, Roosevelt had decided the economy was healthy enough that he could start to balance the federal budget. But with the new crisis, he shifted course again. Abandoning a balanced budget, Roosevelt decided to prime the pump, as he called it, by stimulating the sluggish economy with a quick injection of federal cash into public works projects. Deficit spending, that is, the government spending more money than it took in, helped snap the recession in 1938. That same year, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which created a national minimum wage. During World War II, federal spending skyrocketed from $9 billion to almost $100 billion a year. The war put the United States economy back on its feet. So deficit spending became one of the major legacies of the New Deal. The Second World War would solidify many of the political reforms of the Great Depression and a vast expansion in the size and the role of the federal government. Before 1932, the federal government had little impact on the lives of ordinary Americans. After the New Deal, it affected people's lives in a wide variety of ways. While economic crises in Europe gave rise to dictators like Adolf Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy, in the United States, the Great Depression strengthened democracy and drew more people into political action. In World War II, democracy and fascism would clash in a deadly struggle that would engulf the world.